Condemning the joint U.S.-South Korean military exercises, North Korea disconnected a military communications hotline in March.
쌍방 군부 사이에 개설된 북남군 통신은 더 이상 필요 없게 되었다.
North Korea threatened to shut down the Gaeseong Industrial Complex if Seoul continued to, quote, insult the dignity of the North. And finally follows through on their threat, banning the entry of South Korean workers into the park. The two Koreas reached an agreement on the joint industrial project in the year 2000. 1 year after construction of the complex begins in 2003, the first products roll off the assembly line. There have been crises in the past, but the situation is different this time around.
남북 당국 간 실무회담 개최를 북한 당국에 공식적으로 제의합니다.
The Korean government proposed working-level talks with the North to resolve the impasse. But North Korea refused and even mentioned the possibility of an armed provocation.
기만적인 당국 간 회담설이나 내덜며 우리에게 감히 최후 통첩식 중대 조치라는 것을 운운해댄다면 그것은 최후 파멸만을 속전케 할 뿐이다.
The South Korean government has withdrawn all South Korean personnel from the industrial park for their protection.
공업지구가 이제 와서 끝끝내 깨지게 되면 현 정권은 이명박 적적 패당보다 더한 대결 정권으로 낙인되어 역사와 민족 앞에 두고두고 저주와 규탄을 받게 될 것이라는 것을 알아야 한다. 개성공업지구가 완전히 폐쇄되는 책임은 전적으로 괴뢰패당해지게 될 것이다.
물건 하나라도 더 싣고 나오려고 승용차 지붕에 가득 싸매고 나오는 모습을 전 세계인들이 TV를 통해서 봤는데 서로의 합의가 일순간에 이렇게 물거품이 되는 상황에서 이제 세계 어느 누가 북한에 투자를 하려고 하겠습니까?
What will happen now with the Gaeseong Industrial Complex? Nearly 10 years of economic cooperation between the two Koreas on the verge of collapse. What happened at Gaeseong and what might happen next? For insights, we are joined by Professor Hans Schattle of Yonsei University. Thank you very much for being here today.
Thank you, Scott. Good to be here with you.
Now, you've written extensively about the Gaeseong Industrial Complex, which begs the question, how did an American professor like yourself get involved in and interested in Gaeseong?
Well, Scott, it all started back in 2007. I attended a conference at the Kim Dae-jung Presidential Library here in Seoul. As part of that conference, we went to the Gaeseong Industrial Complex for an afternoon. And I remember one of the participants, I think it was Lee Siegel from New York, saying it was like a magical mystery tour going into North Korea.
A magical mystery tour in what way? What were your impressions?
Well, it was only so much of North Korea. You know, we didn't go to the city of Gaeseong. We went to this small area, in a barren area, no trees. That was the first thing we all noticed as we crossed the DMZ, was that the North Korean landscape was completely different than the South. And then we eventually stumbled upon, it seemed, a small collection of factories out there in the middle of nowhere, a family branch, an uri bank, all the familiar trappings that you might find in some developing area, say in the hinterlands of Seoul, which is of course what Gaeseong really is or was, an hour outside of the city. And we didn't have a chance to talk to the workers. We could see the factories, we could see that they were modern, they seemed clean, the conditions seemed decent and acceptable, probably better than some of the conditions that were in South Korea during the sweatshop years of the 60s and 70s and so forth. But a lot of unanswered questions, and that's part of the difficulty that I think we have with the Gaeseong Industrial Complex now, is that we hear things that come out, but there's also only so much that we hear. It's always been kind of a closed shop, a little bit mysterious to the general public.
In terms of the productivity and what the complex became, did it meet your expectations? Did it turn out the way you thought it would from back in 2007?
Well, honestly, Scott, I really didn't know what to expect in 2007. I was just going along for the ride, quite frankly. Maybe, to get a sense of that, I study European integration. So when I visited Kaesong, my interest was to what extent could we see a parallel, perhaps in, say, early France-Germany cooperation, when France and Germany integrated their coal and steel industries. Could we see something embryonic on the Korean Peninsula where the two Koreas were starting to work past their differences? But of course the analogy with Kaesong would be completely different than France and Germany starting up, the European community, which then became the EU. It would be more like if the two Germanys had had an industrial park together during the Cold War years somewhere. And of course, North Korea also was never East Germany. East Germany was kind of a slavish state, always answering to Moscow, whereas North Korea has always, championed or at least pretended or preached its role as something distinctive and more nationalistic. So even the Germany analogy wasn't perfect. But what I was looking for was an example where the two Koreas, through economic integration in a very confined area, the Europeans, they integrated entire industries, not territory. Here we had the two Koreas trying to take a piece of territory, a piece of land, and put South Korean factories there and put the infrastructure, again, the convenience store and the bank. They only took US dollars. And choco pie, that was, again, one of the big stories of the Gaeseong Industrial Complex in its heyday, that the workers were getting these snacks that they didn't usually have, Western-style snacks coming from the South, that were actually at one point, and probably still are to an extent, being sold on the black market in Pyongyang. So South Koreans always had the perspective, well, even if we don't meet the plans to get 250,000 workers by 2012, at the very least, we've pierced the side of their territory. We've got a little South Korean economics and culture in North Korea. And I think that may be rankling Pyongyang, has rankled them for some time. Well, I think North Korea wanted to send a message in some ways. I think they've been looking for an opportunity to send a message. And that this current period of tension where you had the US and South Korea having military exercises, war games, that from what I've heard were a little bit more advanced, a little bit more ambitious and aggressive, it seems, than past years. Certainly we saw that with the show of force with the nuclear bombers. Now, let's face it, North Korea did test a nuclear missile. So North Korea has been getting a little more aggressive too. But here's, tit for tat, here's a set of military exercises. They were looking for a way to respond that would have some impact, and they found it.
Let's talk a little bit about the stakes here of the Gaeseong complex being closed. We know what's at stake for South Korean firms that operate there, billions and billions of dollars. We don't know as much.
Billions, but hundreds of millions. Yeah.
Sure. We don't know as much about what's at stake for the North Korean workers and the North Korean regime there. What do you see how that plays out there? What's at stake for them?
Well, Scott, I guess we have to follow the money. And the money changes every year. The latest figures I've seen, and we don't really know the details because, again, the management structure is not always the most forthcoming. But I guess the figures for this past year, something like $470 million in output, which is going to the South Korean companies running the place. And then $90 million is going back to the North Koreans in terms of wages. Which is interesting. The place is making more money than before. The wages have doubled for North Koreans. One of my early concerns, just normatively, almost ethically, when I visited was when I found out the wages were something like $50 a month and that the workers themselves weren't getting those wages. I had some human rights concerns about that. And also Human Rights Watch over the years. In the heyday, again, of the Sunshine Policy, that was kind of the emphasis on Kaesong. Is this setting the right tone, perhaps, as a possible nation-building exercise from the standpoint of human rights? But the wages have gone up, at least from that point of view, to about $120 a month per worker, still fairly low. So North Korea now, again, you think about the net gain for the country overall, whether the workers are getting the money or whether the government is taking a cut. We know that they're getting about $90 million, it seems, per year. And that's been increasing. That's just in the past year. So that would stand to increase if cooperation continues, or if the place continued to grow. Again, highly doubtful now. Not clear that they're going to get investors after what's happened. But South Korea is getting more and more money as time goes on in absolute terms and also relative terms. I think it took some time for these factories to become profitable, training the workers. Yes, the North Korean workers were motivated, but I think actually getting the place up to speed took time. I don't think operations up there have been very profitable for the businesses early on. They've been getting much more profitable in recent years. And this leads us to something interesting, Scott. North Korea is gaining leverage because as it gets more profitable for South Korean businesses, North Korea then has more leverage than it had before. So again, we don't know what is behind the exact reasons for the disruption, but part of it is they might want a better deal. They might want a bigger cut of the profits than they've been getting.
And you speculate that's maybe what we're seeing here?
Maybe. I mean, it could be internal too. Daniel Pinkston of the International Crisis Group also wonders if there's internal rivalries, internal tensions within Pyongyang, but this may have nothing to do with South Korea. It might point to some sign of regime instability. That would be another possibility. I mean, of course, another scenario might be that they simply were so angry at the ongoing tests, the ongoing war games, and that things had reached, just such a point where they wanted to make a strong statement, they would disrupt it for a short time. So part of me has also been wondering if now that the military exercises are over, things will come back together. Again, we haven't mentioned it in this conversation. There are still 7 senior level managers up there in Gaeseong. I believe they are mainly from the South Korean management organization that gets funded by the government. The people that have been running the place. These are the people that I would love to interview as an academic to see what's actually going on. So it's hanging on by a thread. It's possible that now the military exercises have ended, that they'll open up sooner rather than later. Now, if it doesn't open up pretty soon, if they don't find a way to patch things up, then we know it wasn't about the military exercises. Then they either just want a better deal, or they're ready to just go it alone and do their joint economic partnerships with China, perhaps, instead of South Korea. That's possible. Or they just don't like having the South Korean influence in there.
For China, though, when they look at the situation going on there, they can't feel comfortable about entering into a joint business project with the North, considering the way things have gone, right?
Well, who knows? I mean, China's not South Korea. China's not at a state of war with North Korea, technical state of war anyway. So it could be a different ballgame with China.
As President Park Geun-hye recently said, the North is unpredictable. We can't predict what's going to happen with any degree of certainty, of course. But there are plenty of opinions out there. Our After 10 team actually took to the streets and spoke to some people who were involved at Gaeseong to get their opinion of what's happening there. Let's take a look.
I think it is too early to mention compensation for damages. The government should strive harder to normalize the industrial park. I think it is still fully possible for the government to put things back the way they were. Of course, the North is an unpredictable country, but we should persuade them persistently to move in the right direction so that we can resolve the crisis we are currently facing.
The shutdown of the Gaeseong Industrial Complex is unfortunate, as it's one of the last business relationships the two Koreas have promoted.
I personally think this is due to the negligence of North Korea. As North and South Korea are not on the same level economically, I think the North is using the Gaeseong Industrial Complex as a means of strengthening its regime.
If the Gaeseong Industrial Complex shuts down permanently, it might weaken relations with the North, and the tensions could escalate even higher than they are now. The North still refuses to talk, but we should put more efforts into quieting things down and engaging in a two-way conversation.
I don't think we have to take it all as being bad. Yes, the Gaeseong Industrial Complex is currently in crisis as we have failed at dialogue, but I still hope we can find a good way to start a conversation.
So we heard there that a lot of people are concerned that this line of communication, this economic tie, has now been severed. How much of a concern is that for you?
Right, that is one concern, Scott, because in the peak of tension, say after the Yeonpyeong-do bombings in late 2010, which was probably the low point of the past few years, and even some hardened North Korea analysts have made the point in the past few days that that situation was actually much more dangerous than what we've gone through, say, in the past month, even if the rhetoric has been more heated. But after Yeonpyeong-do, and also after Cheonan, when the usual lines of communication had been chopped, there was still contact going on at the KIC, at the Gaeseong Industrial Complex. Or even if it, becomes a military base for North Korea, which is another concern that land, since it's so close to the DMZ, in the past it had been used for military purposes. It could be once again. But in terms of communication, even if it goes, I think there will be other ways for them to talk via New York through the UN mission there, even if that sounds very roundabout and indirect. Although another issue we've heard, the New York conversation, the New York channels themselves might be disrupted as well. So that is one consideration. But there was something else that came up in the Q&A interviews that we just saw there. I think one person raised the issue of whether Pyongyang just gets a lifeline from the Gaeseong Industrial Complex. Why should South Korea give North Korea, the tune of $90 million a year now in a windfall that helps sustain their regime, or who knows, helps support the nuclear weapons program up there. And there have been arguments that North Korea doesn't deserve that money from the South anyway. I think, and more from Americans sometimes than South Koreans. The editorial page editors of the Wall Street Journal basically said this month, good riddance, when Pyongyang pulled the plug and kept the workers home. I think one of the blogger here in Seoul put up a headline, North Korea sanctions itself, by shutting down the Gaeseong Industrial Complex. So Park Geun-hye, I think, does have a point when she says who's going to want to invest there now. I mean, China might keep doing business with them, but will their business people be happy? Will their entrepreneurs be happy to go in? Who knows? And I think it's going to be, even if Gaeseong reopens now, I think it's going to be harder for the management committee to get companies interested in going in there. It's been gradually getting bigger. If they reopen now, they might be flatlining for a while. They might be just staying the way they are if they reopen.
And another takeaway from what we just saw there from the people on the street was that they thought the government here should be doing more to sort of engage with the North and getting them back to the table to negotiate. When you look at what President Park Geun-hye did here, she's been preaching a trust politic on the peninsula, of course. When she pulled these workers out, do you think she made the right decision? Did she have a decision at that point?
Yeah, two things are tricky here, Scott. One is public opinion, and one is what is the president actually thinking here. So public opinion, I just don't know. There are segments of the public that would like to see a return to the sunshine policy, make nice with North Korea, even if that may not work. We tried that. South Korea tried that during the sunshine policy years to an extent, and things didn't necessarily work. There are all sorts of reasons as to why. Then there are segments of South Korean public opinion that would be more aggressive, that would just as soon push for reunification now, isolate them, hit back if they hit South Korea, that kind of strain. So I don't know. Public opinion is a bit divided on where to go here, and that's what the president is left with. I think Park Geun-hye and her advisors have to realize the public in some ways is of two segments and of two minds, as the public is on so many issues here in Korea. So the question with Park, in terms of speeding up that negotiation window, the government basically saying the middle of April, and then reinforcing it at the end of April, if North Korea doesn't come back to the table and find a way to reopen this, if they don't start talking to us about a way to normalize the industrial zone, we're going to take our workers out of that. And it was billed as for the protection of South Korean citizens up there, but I don't know how much of it was really about protection. Yes, they didn't have food supplies coming in, they didn't have access to medicine coming in. Of course, you've got people on the other side of the border in a tense situation. There's always the concern about protection. But I wondered if it could be one of two things. Could it be a negotiating tactic to show North Korea that South Korea is serious and that they will walk away if the workers don't show up? I mean, let's face it, the companies were sitting in limbo for the whole month of April. Orders weren't getting filled. Equipment wasn't going in. What's the point of having the people sitting up there just doing nothing, waiting for North Korea to come negotiate? Maybe it's better just to walk away, show the North that they'll give it up, and then let North Korea come back and negotiate to bring the workers back if they want to keep getting that money from South Korea. The other scenario, and I don't know if it's any more likely than what I just outlined, but the other scenario is that the South Korean government was just ready to capitulate, that that North Korea wasn't coming back, that they were ready to walk away, that there's strains again of public opinion both in the U.S. and particularly in South Korea. Why are we giving them this money anyway? Fine, let it go. Pull the people out. So that may not be the state of affairs that we wished for 10 years ago. It's not it doesn't lead us to a happy story where a very small pocket of economic integration on a piece of land can balloon into something wider that sets an inspiring tone for peace, if not unification. But that may just be the reality of the situation where we are now in 2013.
So from your sense, Are we leading to a happy story? Are we leading to a sad story? How does this all play out from your perspective? We don't know, of course, but what's your sense of things?
It's a cliffhanger,
Yeah.
I think.
Yeah.
And it'll play out for a long period of time. Even if North Korea, by the end of today, by the time that our viewers are watching this program, if news has broken that North Korea is coming back and they're going to negotiate, the possibility of reopening, and the business owners have now made a visit to their factories again, even if things are looking up by this weekend. As you said earlier, everything with the North now is unpredictable. So I'm not even sure that's necessarily something to celebrate. It wouldn't be something to lament if it reopens again. But, as I said earlier, I don't really see the trajectory going anymore. I think the best they'll be able to do is just keep the place going as it is. And there might even be some businesses that will pull out. Probably if they reopen, there'll probably be some of the weaker businesses that were less profitable where the owners will just throw in the towel and decide not to go. I would say if they're successful, if they want to have, say, trust building, one step is to try to get this place going again, reopen Gaeseong, normalize it, then maybe try to get Mount Kumgang going again. Try to piece back together what you have dissembled over the past few years. And then there's the bigger question as to whether and how broader talks should start between South Korea, the US, North Korea, maybe the six-party players again. Well, that gets us to the summit meeting between Barack Obama and Park Geun-hye taking place this month.
Certainly more questions and answers at this point, but we do appreciate you being here and answering some of them for us today. Dr. Schattle, thank you very much.
No, thank you for having me, Scott. My pleasure.